What do we know about being a leader? Well, there's a lot of leadership theory. Here's some background, just some quick, sort of a brief history of leadership. You know, back in the Dark Ages, back in history, if you go back historically, we think of leaders as being people who were born into a position. If you go back in time, you think about kings and queens and leaders of countries in earlier times, and they were appointed to that position because they were born in that family. And it wasn't until another family overthrew them, and then that group became the rulers. And you can think of monarchies in all kinds of countries. Great Britain or England comes to mind typically. But so for a long time, the persistent theory was that leaders were great men. And only in the last couple of centuries have we had much evidence of leaders as coming from great women. But in the 20th century, in the 21st century, we're starting to see more and more women as great leaders. So Thomas Carlyle, a famous Scottish philosopher, came up with the quote that said that history is but the biography of great men. That great men really defined how organizations ran and really described our history. And if you take a look, there's all kinds of examples there. You see those photographs of some of the great men that we recognize and some great women from history. But the truth is that we began to explore this and analyze it and critique it more critically, we discovered that there's lots of other things that change the world, not just great leaders. Sometimes our economy, I mean, we're experiencing that right now, how it's had a significant change. There's all kinds of societal things. I mean, whether it could be health-related issues. I mean, there have been history of epidemics and pandemics. They could be environmental things like earthquakes or dinosaurs or asteroids colliding with the planet. And of course, in our current world, technology is transforming almost everything, isn't it? I mean, the way you go to school, the way you learn. Many of you are residential students, but I'll bet you all of you at some point in time have had some exposure to some sort of online or at least hybrid form of learning. It is the way of the world. And you're demanding that more and more. And in fact, your state of Idaho is saying that you can't graduate high school unless you've had some exposure to that. So those kinds of things we know have changed the world as well. So not all great leaders come from great families. That sometimes leaders emerge from other sources. So then we did a study and we tried to figure out, well, where else could those leaders have come from? We developed a theory called the trait approach. Trait theory said simply, we want to try and identify what characteristics do great leaders have in common. And boy, we studied this, and we still study it for years and years and years, and we compiled a really comprehensive list of traits. And I won't go through these chapter and verse with you, but the interesting thing about trait theory, and it still persists today, I mean, there's a notion. Think about an airline pilot. When you think about a really good airline pilot, what image comes to your mind? Tall, tanned, fit, graying slightly at the temples. I'm not describing myself. I can't fly. But that's generally the perception of great leaders. I mean, when we think about great business leaders, that's sort of an image we get. We get this vision of a, late 40s, mid 50s, male, 6 foot tall, fit, tanned, nice haircut, crisp suit. Is that really the leaders of the world? But those are the traits, that's sort of the image, that's what Hollywood shows us. That's what we see in a lot of the media that gets presented today. So we've compiled this list a comprehensive list of hundreds and hundreds of traits. You know what we've discovered? There's not one that's universal to all good leaders. That there is no single trait or single group of traits that can define a particular leader. So while we still persist with trait theory and we still explore, and we're hoping at some point to discover that one common thing. And if there is one common thing, and I will tell you this, the one thing I think all good leaders have is the ability to have a vision of the future. That might be the one universal trait, but there are great leaders who didn't have a vision of the future, but they were able to sustain or maintain their place in history. Another theory that has persisted is what's called Theory X and Theory Y. How many of you are familiar with that? Have you ever heard of that? Douglas McGregor came up in the 1960s. Called Theory X and Theory Y. And it says simply that if you're going to be a leader, you have to know what kind of people you have. And if you're a Theory X leader, or you have Theory X people, you have to manage them very closely. You have to monitor them. That you can't trust them. That given the chance, they'll slack off. They'll sign up for the 4 to 6 workshop and fall asleep. But if you're a Theory Y leader or a Theory Y manager, Or if you have theory Y employees, that suggests that they're there because they want to be, they're interested, and that you can actually trust them. And if you give them a little authority and some accountability to go with it, they'll actually produce pretty good work. You know, I think that's probably true about most of you. That when you're given the chance to do what you can do, you produce pretty good work. And that's generally the way it is with most of us. Most of us haven't got into college unless we were somehow dedicated or willing to go the extra mile. And all we had to have was the freedom to do what we could do. So you might think about yourself and your particular style. And are you a theory X person or are you a theory Y person? And what kind of organization do you want to be part of? One that gets, and what's the common term for theory X? One that gets micromanaged. People are looking over your shoulder all the time, making sure you're doing your work. You have to clock in, you have to clock out. You know, sign in, sign out, check that you're not trustworthy enough. Fred Fiedler came up with a theory called the contingency theory. And contingency theory said that, you know, there are certain factors that come into play when we start to try to develop work in our organizations. He said, you know, there's the task. Sometimes the job matters. And the leadership style plays an important part in how the task gets done. And we're going to talk about leadership style here in just a moment. We just did a little bit. We talked about theory X or theory Y, didn't we? So if the task is one that requires close monitoring, close scrutiny, then maybe theory X would be the right kind of leader to have. If you have a theory Y leader, but you have employees, which Fiedler called the followers, if you have employees that like to goof off, and you think you can trust them, but you really can't, then you can have all kinds of problems in terms of accomplishing that goal. Remember, leadership was about trying to influence a group of people to achieve a common goal, right? I mean, we wanted to accomplish something. So the position and power of the leader, I want to take a moment here and talk about sources of power, because I think it's fairly important. In just about any organization, there is a power differential between those people in charge and those people who are employees, supervisees, followers, whatever term you want to use to describe them. I mentioned that most of you are here because there's something at stake for you. Some credits, a grade, something. That's called reward power. Okay? That there's something that you value, something that you consider to be important, and it makes it worth your time to spend a couple hours here with me this afternoon as opposed to doing something, hanging out with your friends, or going to work, or whatever other kinds of, going to the gym, whatever other activities you might have. Kind of the flip side of that coin, reward power, is coercive power. Some of you may not pass. You may not graduate. You may not complete. You may not get what you want unless you do these sorts of things. And leaders have that sort of power and authority, don't they? They have the power to reward you in some instances, and they have the power to threaten or take away or sanction you in some way. So reward power and coercive power are two sides of sort of the same coin. Incidentally, the primary authors of this particular piece are a couple of researchers by the name of French and Raven, like the language and the word, or the bird. They came up with this back in like 1959. Another type of power is expert power. You're sitting there dutifully paying attention to me because you think I have some expertise. I hope that before the afternoon's over I haven't completely destroyed your image. But you give credence to people because of their level of expertise, that they know something that you don't. And that gives them some authority or some power over you. Now, expert power comes in all sizes and shapes. You know, a child can have expert power. You ever had a little brother or sister, niece or nephew come and say, I know something you don't know? What? All of a sudden they have power and they manipulate you sometimes, don't they? And of course, in the area of victim and victim services, it's all about power, isn't it? It's about that ability to manipulate or control. Usually it's coercive power that's being applied, but sometimes other types of power occur. And then legitimate power. Have you ever been going down the road, looking in your rearview mirror and see these blinking blue lights? Do you respond to that in any way? Why? You pull over, your red lights or blue lights? That's some legitimate power, isn't it? That's power that's backed up by the authority of law, that there's someone has said, whether it's law or if it's policy, or maybe it's just common practice that says, you know, you need to pull over, make right away, stop. You give credit to people with legitimate power simply because of the title they have. The professors in your class have some authority, both expert authority, but legitimate authority. They've been granted by the institution the right to stand in front of the class and teach and direct it. Okay? They've been given the authority to assign particular activities or assignments for you. So that's what we call legitimate authority. And then the last one is called referent power. Referent. Referent refers to something. So sometimes we give power to people, and I think celebrities are a great example of this, simply because of something about them that we like, something that appeals to us. Maybe it's the way they dress. Maybe they wear a sport coat or a tie. Or they have flashy jewelry. The car they drive, the house they live in. They're punctual and on time. You know, when I teach classes, my class starts at the chime of the, when the second hand gets to the top of the hour, that's when class begins. And if you're not there in your seat, that's okay. We're just going to go on without you. But so time is, position power. I mean, I can sometimes, I have more power because I'm standing than you do because you're sitting. And you know that. Sometimes when you work with people, you try and create this referent power by getting down on their level. If you're talking to a small child, what most of you do? Get down on their level, don't you? You get down on one knee, or you sit down with them, or you bring them up to your level, you lift them up, or you sit them on your knee, or you do something to try and get eye to eye. But sometimes when someone's taller or has a position, and you know this in your own, we call that personal space. You get people who are crowding you. Yeah. Or if they kind of tower over you and they do the whole big bird thing, they're leaning over that big old feet. And it's like, hey, back up. This is my space. That's referent power, isn't it? We're giving them power because of something that we like or don't like about them. So contingency leadership has a lot to do with the power status of the particular individual in charge. So here you can see it depends on the task, depends on the follower, and it depends on what the leader's power position is.